In the waning days of the Second Age, when the shadows of Mordor stretched long across Middle-earth, there came a time of great peril. Isildur, son of Elendil the Tall, stood upon the slopes of Mount Doom with the One Ring burning upon his finger. Yet his heart was heavy with a burden greater still than the weight of Sauron's masterwork. For in the great battle upon the slopes of Orodruin, when his father fell beneath the mace of the Dark Lord, the blade Narsil had been sundered. But this was no mere breaking of steel and starlight that the songs would tell in later days. Nay, the sword had been riven by a power far older and more terrible than any knew. The blade, forged in the elder days by Telchar of Nogrod, had been wrought not merely of metal, but had been bound with fragments of the very music of creation itself. 7 shards fell from the breaking of Narsil, and each bore within it a note of the great song that Eru Ilúvatar had sung at the world's beginning. As Isildur knelt amid the fires of the mountain, gathering what remained of his father's sword, he knew not that the shards sang still with power beyond the ken of mortal men. 3 pieces he took unto himself, the hilt and the largest fragments of the blade. But 4 shards had scattered in the tumult of battle, cast far across Middle-earth by the death throes of Sauron's physical form. 1 shard fell into the rushing waters of Anduin, where it would lie hidden beneath the currents for long ages. Another was borne upon the wind to the grey shores of Lindon, where Gil-galad, the Elven king, had made his last stand. The 3rd fragment struck deep into the roots of the misty mountain, buried beneath stone and earth. And the 4th, the smallest yet perhaps the most perilous, vanished entirely from the knowledge of the wise, carried by eagles to destinations unknown. But Isildur, in his haste to depart from that accursed place, perceived not the full magnitude of what had transpired. He bore only the broken hilt and 2 great fragments back to Gondor, believing them to be all that remained of Narsil. Yet even these pieces sang with such power that the very stones of Osgiliath trembled when they were brought within the city's walls. Years passed, and the tale of the broken sword passed into legend. The hilt and the fragments known to men were kept in the house of Elendil, awaiting the day when they might be reforged. But none suspected that the true power of Narsil lay not in these remnants alone, but in the lost shards that bore the deeper melodies of creation. It was not until the Third Age had grown old, when the shadow of Mordor began once more to stretch across the lands, that the first whispers came to the ears of the wise. Elrond Halfelven, keeper of Vilja, mightiest of the 3, felt a stirring in the music that flowed beneath all things. In the depths of Rivendell's archives, ancient texts spoke of powers that could unmake the very foundations of Arda itself, should they fall into the wrong hand. For the 7 shards of Narsil were not merely pieces of a broken blade. They were keys to the fundamental forces that held Middle-earth in its appointed course. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of the free peoples, a new power was stirring, one that had learned of their existence and coveted them above all other treasures. Thus begins the tale of the Shards of Narsil and of the great hunt that would determine the fate of all who dwelt beneath the sky. The leaves of Rivendell had turned to gold and crimson when Gandalf the Grey returned from his wanderings in the wild lands beyond the misty mountain. His staff struck sharp upon the stones of the courtyard, and his weathered face bore the lines of one who has looked upon troubling vision. Elrond received him in the Hall of Fire, where the ancient songs of the elder days still echoed in the shadows between the pillars. "Dark tidings I bring, Master Elrond," said the wizard, settling his grey robes about him like gathering storm clouds. "In the depths of Moria, where the drums of the orcs beat loud, I have sensed a stirring of powers long thought lost. The very stones of Khazad-dûm sing with an alien melody, one that speaks of the music primordial." Elrond's eye, grey as the twilight sea, grew troubled. "Then my fears are given form," he replied, "for I too have felt this disturbance in the deep currents of the world. Come, let us speak of matters that few in Middle-earth have knowledge, and fewer still would believe." In the Chamber of the Ring, where the greatest councils of the wise were held, Elrond drew forth from a casket of mithril an ancient scroll. Upon it were written words in the Tengwar of Feanor, but in a script so old that even the wizard's keen eyes struggled to decipher their meaning. This was written by Gil-galad before his final ride to war, Elrond said softly. In it, he speaks of visions that came to him in dream, of a blade that was more than steel, wrought with fragments of the song itself. 7 notes of power, he wrote, bound within the metal by arts, now lost to time. Gandalf leaned forward, his gray eyes sharp as winter stars. Then the legends speak truth. Narsil was not merely the sword of kings, but a weapon forged from the very music of creation. And if the shards that were lost carry within them such power, Elrond finished grimly, then their recovery becomes a matter of the utmost urgency. For there are those who would use such might to unmake the very order of things. Even as they spoke, far to the north in the halls of Thranduil, the Woodland King felt a strange disquiet. In his deep vaults beneath the earth, where the treasures of the woodland realm were kept, there had come a singing in the night. His guards reported dreams of silver light, and voices speaking in tongues unknown since the music of the Ainur filled the void. From the Grey Havens, Círdan the shipwright sent word by swift messenger. One of his people, walking the shores at dawn, had found upon the strand a piece of metal unlike any they had seen, neither silver nor mithril, but something that seemed to hold starlight within its very substance. When touched, it sang with such beauty and such power that the finder had wept for the joy and terror of it. The summons went out from Rivendell with all speed to Lothlorien, where Galadriel the Wise held court beneath the Malern trees, to the Grey Havens, where the sea-longing stirred in elvish hearts, and to the hidden kingdoms of men, where the blood of Númenor still ran strong in the veins of the Dúnedain. Within a sennight, the greatest of the wise had gathered in Rivendell. Galadriel came with Celeborn her lord, their faces grave with the weight of foresight. Círdan arrived bearing the shard that had been found upon his shores, wrapped in white silk that could not entirely contain its radiance. From the south came Boromir of Gondor, bearing word from Denethor, the ruling steward, and with him rode rangers of the north, whose eyes held the wisdom of the wild. But it was the arrival of an unexpected guest that caused the greatest stir in the halls of Elrond. Saruman the White, greatest of the Istari, came riding from Orthanc with a small company of men clad in the colors of Isengard. His white robes gleamed like snow in sunlight, and his staff was crowned with crystal that caught and held the light. "I come," he said when the council was assembled, "because I too have felt the stirring of powers that should lie quiet. In my studies of the ancient lore, I have uncovered references to weapons of such might that their very existence threatens the stability of Arda itself." Gandalf regarded his fellow wizard with eyes that held a shadow of mistrust, though none present could have said why. "And what counsel do you offer, Saruman the White?" "That we gather these fragments before others may claim them," Saruman replied, his voice smooth as honey poured over steel. "For there are servants of the Shadow who have learned of their existence, and even now send forth seekers to claim them for their master." Thus was formed the Fellowship of the Shards, sworn to seek out and secure the fragments of Narsil before they could fall into the hands of the enemy. Yet none who sat in that council could foresee the true nature of the peril that lay ahead, nor the price that would be paid for their recovery. The Fellowship of the Shards divided into 3 companies, each charged with seeking one of the lost fragment. To Boromir of Gondor was given the task of searching the waters of Anduin, for in the archives of Minas Tirith lay ancient maps marking the places where the river ran deep and strange currents moved beneath the surface. With him went Gimli the dwarf, son of Glóin, whose knowledge of stone and watercourses was renowned even in Rivendell, and Legolas Greenleaf of the woodland realm, whose eyes could pierce the veils that water casts over hidden things. Gandalf the Grey accompanied them, for his power might be needed to draw forth what lay beneath the River Queen's protection. They set forth from Rivendell as the last leaves fell from the trees, following the paths that wound down from the hidden valley to the rushing waters below. The Bruinen sang its ancient song as they crossed, But beneath its melody, the companions heard another tune, fainter, deeper, like the echo of a bell tolling in the depths of the earth. For 7 days they rode beside Anduin, searching the places where the river ran deep and slow. Legolas would stand upon the banks, with his bow unstrung, listening to the voices of the water, while Gimli cast his nets into the current, weighted with stones carved with dwarf runes of finding. Boromir kept watch, for the lands beside the river were not safe for travelers, and orcs from the misty mountains often came down to drink at the water's edge. On the 8th day, as they made camp beside the Gladden fields where Isildur had met his doom, Gandalf felt a stirring in the airs about him. The wizard's staff began to gleam with soft white light, and the waters of Anduin grew still as glass. "Here," he said softly, "lies what we seek, but the River Queen will not give up her treasure easily." Into the dark waters, Gandalf cast his staff, and where it touched the surface, circles of light spread outward like ripples on a pond. Far below, something answered with a gleam of its own, not silver nor gold, but the pale radiance of starlight, caught in crystal. "I see it!" cried Legolas, his keen eyes piercing the depths. "But it lies beneath stone and weed, in a place where the current runs strong. No mortal swimmer could reach such depths and live." Gimli grunted and began to shed his mail. "Then it's a good thing I'm no mortal, but a dwarf of Durin's folk, and we know the ways of water as well as stone. Dew!" But before the stout-hearted dwarf could plunge into the river, Gandalf raised his staff high. "Nay, friend Gimli, this task requires arts beyond those of sword and axe. Stand back and witness the power that flows in the deep places of the world." The wizard began to speak in a tongue older than the hills, words that rang like bells across the water. The surface of Anduin began to churn and foam, and from the depths arose shapes of mist and spray that took the form of horses running with the current. These were the horses of Ulmo, the Lord of Water, and at their head rode a figure crowned with foam and trailing garments of green weed. This was Nimrodel, the river spirit, who dwelt in the depths of Anduin, sister to the Lady of the Mithithil and daughter of the sea. Her voice was like the sound of water falling over stones, and her eyes held the memory of all that had passed beneath her waves. "Mithrandir," she spoke, and her words rippled like the current. "Thou dost ask for that which was given to my keeping in the years when the world was younger. The fragment of the sword that cuts deep lies beneath my protection, wrapped in weeds and silence." "Lady of the Waters," Gandalf replied with a deep bow, "great is the need of the free peoples. The shadow grows strong in the east and seeks that which should remain hidden. Grant us this boon, and the debt of the wise shall be ever upon thee." Nimroddel's laugh was like the sound of rapids over rock. "The wizard speaks of debts, but what can the servants of the land give to the children of the sea? Yet I perceive a greater darkness gathering, and I would not see all things drowned in shadow." She raised her hand, and the waters of the river began to part, revealing the muddy bottom where strange growths of weed and coral had formed shapes like towers and walls. There, gleaming amid the river wrack, lay a shard of metal that sang with inner light. Boromir stepped forward, his hand upon his sword. "I claim this fragment by right of birth," he declared, "for I am of the line of Elendil, and Narsil was the sword of my father." But as he reached toward the glowing shard, Nimrodel spoke again. "Hold, son of Denethor. This fragment bears within it the note of deep waters, one of the 7 sounds of creation. He who would claim it must prove his worth, not through strength of arm, but through the depths of his heart." "Name the test," Boromir said proudly, "and I shall not be found wanting." The river spirit smiled, and her smile was both beautiful and terrible. "Look into the waters and see what lies beneath the surface of thy soul." The waters of Anduin became as clear as crystal, and in their depths appeared visions that made even the stout-hearted captain of Gondor step backward in dismay. He saw himself standing in the ruins of Minas Tirith, with the banner of the White Tree torn and trampled in the dust. He saw his father, gray and bent with despair, casting himself from the heights of the citadel. he saw the people of Gondor fleeing before the hosts of Mordor, their white city burning behind them. And in the midst of these dark visions, he saw himself wielding a blade that gleamed with terrible power, not the reforged Anduril, but a sword wrought from all 7 shards of Narsil, a weapon that could unmake the very foundations of the world. "I see thy heart, son of Gondor," Nimrodel said softly. "Thou lovest thy city and thy people above all else, yet in that love lies the seed of thy downfall. The power thou seekest to save them might destroy all that thou holdest dear." Boromir knelt beside the water, his proud head bowed. "Then I am not worthy of this burden." "Nay," came a gentle voice from behind him. It was Legolas who spoke, his fair face grave with understanding. "Worthiness lies not in the absence of temptation, but in the recognition of it. Rise, Prince of Gondor." The test was not to be perfect, but to see clearly. And as Boromir rose, his hand trembling only slightly, he reached once more toward the shard. This time, no vision clouded his sight. The fragment of Narsil rose from the riverbed and settled into his palm, where it blazed with cold fire that did not burn. Thus was the first of the lost shards recovered, though at a price that would not be fully understood until the ending of the tale. While Boromir and his companions sought the river's treasure, Galadriel and Celeborn rode northward toward the Grey Havens, where Círdan the shipwright had found the second of the lost fragment. With them came Elrohir and Elladan, the twin sons of Elrond, whose hearts burned with the desire to see the ancient powers restored to their proper keeping. The road to Lindon wound through the Shire, where the hobbits dwelt in peace and plenty, knowing little of the great affairs that stirred beyond their borders. Yet even in the green lands of the little folk, the companions felt the stirring of powers awaken. The very air seemed to thrum with tension, like a harp string drawn too tight. Galadriel rode in silence for much of the journey, her blue eyes distant with foresight. In her mind, she perceived the threads of possibility that stretched out from each moment, weaving patterns of light and shadow across the tapestry of time. Not all the paths she saw led to hope, and in many of them she beheld the free peoples walking into darkness from which there would be no return. "What troubles thee, lady?" asked Celeborn as they made camp beneath the stars in the old forest, where the trees whispered secrets older than the kingdoms of men. "I have looked upon the mirror," she replied softly, "and in its depths I have seen the face of our true enemy. The shadow of Mordor is but a servant, and the one who commands him seeks not dominion over Middle-earth, but its utter destruction." Elladan leaned forward from where he sat beside the fire. "Speak plainly, what enemy is this that you have perceived?" Galadriel was quiet for a long moment, listening to the voices of the wind in the branches above. When she spoke again, her voice was heavy with sorrow. "In the void, before the world was made, there dwelt one who was mighty among the Ainur, yet whose heart turned to darkness when the music began. Melkor, whom mortals name Morgoth, was cast into the void at the end of the Elder Days. Yet the void is not empty, and even there, the echoes of the great song may be heard." "You speak of legends," said Elrohir, though his voice held doubt. "I speak of what I have seen," the lady replied. "Melkor has learned to weave new patterns from the fragments of the song that drift in the darkness beyond the world. He cannot return to Arda by his own power, but if one were to gather the 7 shards of Narsil and speak the words of unmaking that are written upon them, speak." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant hooting of an owl. All present understood the magnitude of the peril. For if Melkor the Morgoth were to return to Middle-earth, not even the Valar themselves might have the power to cast him out again. On the 3rd day of their journey, they came at last to the Grey Havens, where the white ships of the elves rode at anchor in the harbor. Círdan met them at the gates of his city, his ancient face grave with concern. "Welcome, Lady of Lothlorien," he said with a deep bow. "I fear the gift I bear is not one that brings joy to the heart." He led them to a chamber deep within his tower, where walls of white stone were carved with images of ships and seabirds. There, upon a table of black marble, lay a fragment of metal wrapped in silk, that gleamed like moonlight on water. It was found 3 days past upon the shore, Círdan explained, cast up by the tide near the place where Gil-galad once walked in contemplation. When my people brought it to me, the very touch of it filled the harbor with music, such as has not been heard since the days of the trees. Galadriel approached the table with steps slow and measured, as one who walks toward her doom. When she drew back the silk, the fragment blazed with such radiance that all present were forced to shield their eyes. But within the light, they heard music, not the harsh discord they had expected, but a melody of such beauty that tears flowed unbidden down their cheeks. "This is the note of sea longing," the lady whispered, "the sound that calls to the hearts of the Eldar and draws them ever toward the west. Yet something is wrong. The melody is twisted, filled with a hunger that was not there when the world was young." Celeborn drew near to his lady's side. "What corruption has touched it?" Before Galadriel could answer, the air in the chamber began to shimmer, and forms of mist and shadow took shape around them. From the walls stepped figures in robes of gray and silver, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. In their hands, they bore weapons of crystal and starlight, and their voices rose in harmonies that made the very stones tremble. "We are the guardians of the shore," they spoke in unison, "servants of Manwë, the Elder King. Long have we waited for this day, when the fragments of the song would be gathered once again." Eladan's hand moved to his sword, but his father's teaching stayed his arm. These were beings of power beyond the measure of mortal weapons, and their purpose was not yet clear. "Why have you come?" asked Galadriel, though her heart already knew the answer. "To offer a choice," the guardians replied. "The shard may be taken, but at a price. He who claims it must bear not only its power, but its burden. For this fragment holds within it the accumulated sea longing of all the Eldar who have passed into the west, and he who touches it will be forever drawn to follow." Celeborn stepped forward, his silver hair bright in the light of the shard. "Then let it be me who pays this price, for I am old in years and wisdom, and the burden will not weigh as heavily upon my heart." But it was Elrohir who reached out first, his young face set with determination. "Nay, Lord Celeborn, I am of the younger kindred, and my strength is undiminished. Let the burden fall upon me." "Stay thy hand, my son," came a voice from the doorway. There stood Elrond half-elven, arrived by paths swifter than the wind, "for I have perceived in the music of this place the note that was foretold. The Shard of Lindon shall not be borne by any here present." All eyes turned to the Lord of Rivendell as he stepped into the chamber. Upon his brow shone the light of Vilya, mightiest of the three rings, and in his eyes burned the wisdom of ages. "There is one coming who has greater claim to this burden," Elrond said quietly, "one whose destiny is bound to the fate of the sword. Let the shard remain here in Círdan's keeping until that day arrives." And though none understood his meaning fully, all felt the truth in his words. The second shard would wait for its appointed bearer, and the free peoples could only trust in the wisdom of the wise to guide their steps in the darkness that lay ahead. Far to the east, in the depths of the misty mountains, where the drums of Moria beat their endless rhythm, Saruman the White led his own company in search of the third lost shard. With him rode Wormtongue, his counselor from Rohan, and a band of Dunlendings whose knowledge of the secret ways beneath the earth was surpassed by none save the dwarves themselves. The entrance to the ancient realm of Khazad-dûm yawned before them like a mouth opened in silent scream, the great doors of Durin hanging broken and askew upon their hinges. The company of the Ring had passed this way not long before, and the evidence of their passage and of their battle with the Balrog lay scattered in the darkness beyond. "My lord," whispered Grima Wormtongue, his pale eyes reflecting the torchlight like a serpent's, "surely it would be wisdom to turn back. The drums speak of dangers that even your power might not overcome." Saruman's laugh was cold as winter wind upon stone. "Peace, thou craven dog. The flame of Udun is gone from these halls, and what dwells here now are but shadows and echoes. We shall claim what we seek, and depart, before the orcs dare venture from their deeper lairs. Into the darkness they went, following passages carved by dwarf hands in ages past. When Durin the Deathless walked among his people, and the light of the Silmarils still shone upon the world, the air grew thick and foul as they descended, and strange lights flickered in the depths, not the warm glow of forge fire, but the cold radiance of decay. For 3 days they wandered in the maze of tunnels, guided by signs that Saruman alone could read. The White Wizard bore with him a staff crowned with a crystal of unusual hue, and by its light he traced patterns upon the walls that had been carved there in the elder days. These were the runes of deep seeking, wrought by the dwarf lords when they delved too deep and too greedily in the roots of the earth. On the 4th day, they came at last to a vast hall whose roof was lost in shadow, supported by pillars carved in the likeness of great trees. This was the Chamber of Mazarbul, the Hall of Records, where the final battle of Balin's company had been fought. Here lay the tomb of Balin, son of Fundin, and here too the company of the Ring had made their stand against the hosts of Moria. But it was not the tomb that drew Saruman's attention, nor the evidence of recent battle. His crystal-crowned staff blazed with sudden light, and in that radiance they saw what they had come to find. Set into the wall behind Balin's tomb was a niche carved in the shape of a 7-pointed star. Within it lay a fragment of metal that pulsed with inner fire, and about it the very stones sang with harmonies that made the mountain tremble. This was the 3rd Shard of Narsil, the note of earth song that bound the roots of the world in their appointed places. "Behold," said Saruman softly, "the prize for which we have ventured into this accursed place. With this fragment in my possession, the secrets of creation itself shall be laid bare." But as he reached toward the niche, the air of the chamber grew suddenly cold, and from the shadows came a voice that spoke in the tongue of the dwarves. "Hold, wizard. That which lies there is not for thy taking." Into the circle of light stepped a figure clad in armor of silver and steel, his beard white as snow, and his eyes bright as stars. Upon his head was set a crown of mithril, and in his hands he bore an axe, whose blade gleamed with runes of power. "Durin!" gasped one of the Dunlendings, falling to his knees in terror. "Durin the Deathless walks again!" The apparition smiled grimly. "Nay, I am but the echo of what was, the shadow of the dwarf king who delved these halls in days of old. But I am bound to this place by oaths stronger than death, and I will not suffer the treasures of my people to be stolen by servants of the shadow." Saruman's eyes blazed with wrath, and his staff rang upon the stone floor like a bell of doom. "Begone, shade! I am Saruman the White, chief of the Astari, and no phantom of the past shall bar my way." The power of the wizard's voice made the very pillars shake, but the spirit of Durin stood unmoved. "I know thee, Kuranir," he replied, using the elven name by which Saruman was known in Valinor. "Once thou wert wise among the Astari, but now thy heart is turned toward the darkness. The shard thou seekest bears within it the power to crack the very foundations of the world, and I will not see it fall into thy hands. Then thou shalt be destroyed," snarled Saruman, raising his staff high. White fire blazed from its crystal head, and the chamber was filled with the sound of thunder. But the spirit of Durin raised his axe, and where the fire struck its blade, the flames turned back upon their sender. "I am bound to the deeps of the earth," the dwarf king said calmly, "and while the mountains stand, I cannot be unmade by mortal power." The battle that followed shook the very roots of the misty mountains. Saruman's rage was terrible to behold, and the power he wielded was great indeed, for he was mighty among the Astari, and his knowledge of the secret arts was surpassed by few. But the spirit of Durin was bound to the mountain itself, and drew strength from the stone and earth around him. At last, when the chamber lay in ruins and great cracks showed in the pillars, Saruman stayed his hand. His white robes were torn and stained, and his crystal staff was dim with exhaustion. "This is not ended," he said, his voice hoarse with fury. "The shard will be mine, though I must bring down the mountain itself to claim it." "Then bring it down," replied Durin's shade, "and know that in doing so, thou dost seal thy own doom, for the mountains are the bones of the earth, and he who breaks them breaks himself." Saruman and his company withdrew from the ruined chamber, but the White Wizard's heart was filled with a consuming desire for the power that lay beyond his reach. In that hour, the last vestiges of wisdom left him, and he began to plot such schemes as would shake the very foundations of Middle-earth. The third shard remained in its niche, guarded by the sleepless spirit of the Dwarf King, but the price of its protection was higher than any could know. In the high places of the misty mountains, where eagles soar above the clouds and the wind speaks in tongues older than the speech of men, the search for the fourth shard led to realms seldom seen by mortal eyes. It was Radagast the Brown who took up this quest, for among all the Astari, he alone could speak the languages of the beasts and call upon the aid of the creatures of the wild. With him went a company strange indeed. Tom Bombadil, that enigmatic being who was old when the world was young, and whose power over the ancient places was greater than any save the Valar themselves. Quickbeam the Ent, swiftest of the tree shepherds, whose knowledge of the growing things extended even to the highest peaks. And Shadowfact, the lord of the Miaras, whose hoofbeats could wake echoes in the very halls of Manwë. They climbed by paths known only to the mountain goats and the great eagles, following signs that Radagast read in the flight of birds and the patterns of clouds across the sky. For the Brown Wizard had felt the fourth shard calling from the heights, its song interweaving with the music of wind and storm. "Here," said Tom Bombadil, as they stood upon a peak that thrust like a spear point into the blue sky. "Here the eagles brought their prize when the world was younger, and the mountains sang with voices of gold. But what was hidden in joy may yet be found in sorrow. Above them wheeled a great eagle, larger than any they had seen, its wings casting shadows like those of cloud. This was Gwaihir, the Wind Lord, chieftain of the great eagle, and his voice rang out like the sound of wind through canyon wall. "Radagast the bird friend," he called, circling lower on the mountain updrafts. "Why do you seek in the high places what belongs to the deeps of the earth?" "Because, my lord Gwaihir," the Brown Wizard replied, raising his staff in greeting, "the fragment we seek was borne aloft by your kin in the days of the last alliance. Where eagles fly, eagles remember, and the memory of your people is long indeed." The great eagle alighted upon a crag nearby, his golden eyes bright with ancient wisdom. I remember the tale as it was told to me by my fathers. When Sauron fell upon Mount Doom, fragments of the great sword were scattered by the winds of his defeat. One piece my grandfather's grandfather bore to the heights, thinking it a treasure worthy of our halls. "And where lies this treasure now?" asked Quickbeam, his branchy voice rustling like leaves in autumn wind. Gwaihir turned his keen gaze toward a peak that rose like a needle of black stone against the sky. "There, in the halls of wind and storm, where we built our first eyrie after the world was made. But beware, the fragment has changed in the long years of its keeping. It sings now with voices that speak of ending, not beginning. The path to the eagle's ancient eyrie led through passes where the air was thin as glass, and the cold was bitter enough to freeze the breath in mortal lungs. Only the power of Tom Bombadil kept them from perishing in that desolate realm, for he sang songs that warmed the heart and strengthened the limbs against the mountain's bitter bite. As they climbed, Radagast felt a growing unease, for the birds that were his constant companions grew silent and flew away as they approached their destination. Even Shadowfax, mightiest of all horses, trembled as he picked his way among the ice-slicked rocks. "Something is amiss," the Brown Wizard muttered, his weather-beaten face creased with worry. "The song of the shard grows stronger, but it is joined by another melody, one that speaks of discord and strife." They came at last to a shelf of stone upon which the eagles had built their ancient hall. Here were chambers carved from the living rock, their walls polished smooth by countless generations of talons and beaks. But the halls were not empty as they had expected. In the great chamber at the heart of the eyrie, they found the eagles gathered in council, their voices raised in harsh debate. At the center of their circle, upon a pedestal of white stone, lay the fourth shard of Narsil. But it was not as Gwaihir had described it. No longer did it shine with the pure light of creation, but pulsed instead with a radiance dark and fell. "My lords," said Gwaihir, spreading his wings wide to encompass the gathering, "I have brought the seekers you foretold, but see how the fragment has changed since last we spoke of it." An ancient eagle, her feathers white with age beyond counting, turned her fierce gaze upon the company. "I am Landroval, eldest of this eyrie, and I have watched over the fragment since my youth. But in recent days, it has begun to sing with voices not of this world, voices that speak of the void beyond the circles of creation." Tom Bombadil stepped forward, his bright eyes serious for once. "May I examine it, my lady? For I am older than the mountains themselves, and I may recognize what others cannot." The ancient eagle inclined her head, and Tom approached the pedestal. As his hands drew near the shard, the air around it began to shimmer, and all present heard the sound of music, but it was a melody twisted and wrong, as if the very notes had been bent out of their proper shapes. "Alas," said Tom softly, his usually cheerful voice heavy with sorrow, "this fragment has been touched by the shadow that lies beyond the world. See how its light flickers between silver and black. This is not corruption from within, but contamination from without." Radagast leaned closer, his brown robes stirring in an unfelt wind. "You speak of the void, old friend, but how can that which lies beyond touch what dwells within it?" "Because," came a voice from the entrance to the chamber, "there are those who have learned to bridge the gap between what is and what is not." All turned to see a figure in robes of deepest blue standing in the doorway. This was Palando, one of the blue wizards who had vanished into the east in the early days of the Third Age. But his face was gaunt with weariness, and his eyes held shadows that spoke of visions too terrible to bear. "Palando!" cried Radagast, rushing to embrace his fellow Istari. "Long have we mourned your loss. Where have you been these many years?" "In the lands beyond the Sea of Rune," Palando replied wearily, "fighting a war that few in the West even know exists. For in the Far East, servants of the Void have been at work, seeking ways to crack the barriers that separate what is from what is not." He pointed to the pulsing shard upon its pedestal. "This fragment has been touched by their arts, changed into something that no longer serves creation, but seeks instead to unmake it. Even now, it calls to its master across the gulfs of space and time." Quickbeam's branches rustled with alarm. "Then we must destroy it, ere it brings greater evil upon us all." "Nay," said Palando grimly, "for that would be to play into our enemy's hands. The fragment cannot be destroyed by any power in Middle-earth. Such was the craft of its making. But neither can it be allowed to remain here, where its corruption might spread to other things. Then what counsel do you offer?" asked Gwaihir, his voice sharp with concern for his people. Palando was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed upon the twisted shard. When he spoke again, his words chilled the hearts of all who heard them. "There is a way, but the price is high. The fragment can be cleansed, but only by one who is willing to take its corruption into himself. And such a one would be forever chained, bound to walk between the light and the darkness until the ending of the world." Tom Bombadil stepped forward once more, his face serene despite the magnitude of what was being asked. "Then let it be me, for I am beyond the reach of time and change, and the shadow cannot touch what belongs to neither light nor dark." But as he reached for the shard, Radagast caught his arm. "Hold, old friend. There may yet be another way. The corruption comes from without. Perhaps it can be drawn out again if we can find its source." It was then that Palando spoke the words that would change the course of their quest forever. "The source is known to me, for I have seen it in my wanderings. In the wastes beyond Rhûn stands a tower built of stone that never knew the light of sun or star. There dwells one who was once of the Istari, but who has learned to commune with the powers of the void. Who? Whispered Radagast, though his heart already knew the answer. Alatar, my companion of old, Pallando said, with infinite sadness. He who was once called the Blue, but who now serves masters darker than any shadow that dwells in Mordor. Thus was revealed the first part of the great betrayal that would shake the very foundations of the wise. For if one of the Istari had indeed turned to the void, then the peril was greater than any had dared imagine. The revelation of Alatar's fall cast a shadow over all the councils of the wise. In Rivendell, Elrond walked the halls of his house with steps heavy with foreboding, for he alone among those present remembered the blue wizards in the days of their glory, when they had stood beside their fellows in the fight against the darkness. "How can this be?" asked Gandalf, his gray eyes troubled. "The Istari were chosen by the Valar themselves, and their spirits were proof against the corruption of the Shadow." "Against the Shadow, aye," replied Pallando, who had journeyed swiftly from the Eyrie of the Eagles to bring word to Rivendell. "But the void that lies beyond the circles of the world follows different laws. It does not corrupt, it unmakes, and in unmaking, it offers a terrible freedom from the constraints of creation itself." Elrond studied the maps that lay spread upon the table before him, tracing with his finger the paths that led eastward beyond the borders of the known world. "Tell us of this tower, and of what Alatar has become." Pallando's face was grave as he spoke. "I came upon it in my wanderings 5 years past, following rumors of a great fortress built in the uttermost east. The tower rises from a plain of black glass, and its stones were quarried from the void itself. They drink light and give back only darkness." He paused, his eyes distant with the memory of what he had seen. "Alatar dwells there still. But he is no longer the wizard who left the Grey Havens in the company of my younger days. He has learned to speak with the powers that dwell in the emptiness between the stars, and they have taught him arts that were never meant for beings bound to the music of creation." "What arts?" pressed Gandalf, though he feared the answer. "Power to reach across the gulf between what is and what is not," Pallando replied slowly. "To touch things that exist within and twist them into shapes that serve the purposes of the void. The corruption of the fourth shard is but the beginning. If he is not stopped, he will seek to gather all 7 fragments and use them to tear apart the very fabric of reality." Galadriel, who had listened in silence, now spoke. "Then we must move swiftly, ere his power grows beyond our ability to challenge. The corruption must be drawn from the shard, and its source destroyed." "But how?" asked Boromir, his hand resting upon the first shard that hung at his side. "If this Alatar commands powers beyond our understanding, what hope have we of standing against him?" It was Tom Bombadil who answered, his usually merry voice solemn. "The void is mighty, but it is not absolute. There are powers older still than the darkness between the stars, and music that was sung before the first word was spoken in the emptiness." He turned to Elrond with eyes that held depths of knowledge beyond measure. "The time has come to speak of things that have long been hidden. In the deeps of Rivendell, beneath the foundations of your house, there lies a chamber that was sealed in the Elder Days. Within it rest the instruments of the music, not echoes or shadows, but fragments of the very song that shaped the world." Elrond's face paled. "You speak of things that should remain hidden until the ending of all things." "Aye," said Tom simply, "but the ending may be closer than we think. If the Void Servant gathers the shards and speaks the words of unmaking, there will be no more songs to sing and no more stories to tell." The council fell silent as the weight of the choice before them became clear. To use the instruments of the music was to risk unmaking themselves, for mortal minds were not meant to wield the forces that had shaped the foundations of the world. Yet if they did not act, all might be lost to the hungering emptiness of the void. It was Gandalf who spoke first. "I will go," he said quietly. "The Istari were sent to Middle-earth to guard against the return of the Shadow. and if one of our number has turned to serve the void, then it falls to me to stop him." "Not alone," said Aragorn, stepping forward from where he had stood silent in the shadows. "I am Isildur's heir, and the burden of Narsil's breaking falls upon my bloodline. If the shards are to be cleansed, then I must be there to see it done." One by one, others stepped forward to pledge their aid. Legolas and Gimli, bound by friendship forged in the fires of war. Boromir, driven by love of his city and his people. Galadriel and Celeborn, wise in the lore of the Elder Days, and even the sons of Elrond, though their father would have kept them safe in Rivendell. But it was the arrival of an unexpected ally that would prove most crucial to their quest. As the council debated the path ahead, a horn sounded at the gates of Rivendell, not the clear note of the guards, but a deep, thrilling call that spoke of vast spaces and freedom under the open sky. Into the courtyard rode a company of horsemen clad in green and brown, their faces weathered by wind and sun. At their head rode a tall man whose dark hair was streaked with silver, and whose eyes held the wisdom of one who had walked many paths and seen the ending of many tales. "Hail, Elrond half-elven," he called as he dismounted from his great horse. "I am Eradin of the Dunedain, and I bring word from the wild lands of the east. The Palantir of Orthanc has shown us visions of a great darkness rising beyond the Sea of Rhûn, and we have come to offer our swords to the free peoples." But it was not the offer of aid that brought hope to the hearts of the council, but what Eredin bore with him. From his saddlebags, he drew a bundle wrapped in oiled leather, and when he unwrapped it, all present gasped in wonder and fear. There lay the 7th Shard of Narsil, the fragment that had been thought lost beyond recovery. It blazed with pure white light, unmarked by any shadow or corruption, and its song was clear and true as it had been on the day of its making. "Where did you find this?" asked Elrond, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the ruins of Fornost," Eredin replied, "in the tomb of the last king of Arthedain. It was left there by one who knew that the day would come when all the shards must be gathered, for good or ill." Thus was the final piece of the puzzle revealed, and the true scope of the quest made clear. 7 shards there were, and 4 were now in the keeping of the free peoples. But time was running short, for in the east, the Void Servant worked to corrupt what remained, and if he succeeded, the very foundations of Middle-earth would crumble into nothingness. The stage was set for the final confrontation, and the fate of all who dwelt beneath the sky hung in the balance. In the depths beneath Rivendell, where the roots of the mountains delved deep into the bones of the earth, Elrond led the company to a chamber that had not been opened since the Elder Days. The passage was sealed with words of power written in the Tengwar of Feanor, and as the Lord of Rivendell spoke the ancient passwords, the very air seemed to thrum with awakening power. The door that barred their way was wrought of no earthly metal, but seemed to be made of crystallized music itself, transparent yet solid, singing with harmonies that made the heart rejoice and tremble in equal measure. When it swung open at Elrond's command, light poured forth that was older than the sun and moon, the very radiance of the flame imperishable that burns at the heart of all creation. "Behold," said Elrond softly, "the chamber of echoes, where the instruments of the music await those who would wield them in the cause of righteousness." The chamber beyond was vast beyond measure, its roof lost in shadows that seemed to dance with their own inner light. Along the walls stood alcoves carved from single crystals, and in each alcove rested an instrument of such beauty and power that mortal eyes could scarce look upon them. There were harps whose strings were wrought from the light of stars, and horns carved from the bones of the great whales that swam in the seas before the world was made. Drums there were whose skins had been stretched across frames of living wood, and pipes whose music could call forth the very essence of wind and storm. But it was the instrument that stood at the chamber's heart that drew all eyes and filled all hearts with wonder and dread. Upon a pedestal of white stone rested a harp of such surpassing beauty that it seemed to have been woven from the dreams of the Valar themselves. Its frame was carved from a single piece of wood that had grown in the light of the two trees, and its strings were wrought from mithril so pure that it sang with its own inner radiance. "This is Tyalaconda," said Elrond with deep reverence, "the harp of restoration, wrought by Manwë himself in the music's earliest day. It alone has the power to cleanse what has been corrupted by the void, but the price of its use is high beyond measure." Tom Bombadil stepped forward, his bright eyes studying the ancient instrument. "I have seen this harp before, in dreams that came to me when the world was younger, but I fear its music, for it sings not only of healing, but of ending." "What endings?" asked Aragorn, though his heart already knew the answer. "The ending of the Third Age," Tom replied sadly, "and the fading of all that has made Middle-earth fair and strange. For the harp of restoration does not merely cleanse, it returns all things to their appointed courses, and some of those courses lead into the twilight of the world." Galadriel approached the harp, with steps slow and measured, her face pale with the weight of foresight. "I have seen this moment in the mirror," she said softly, "and I know what must be done. The corruption of the fourth shard spreads even now, reaching out to touch the other fragments. If we do not act, all seven will be twisted to serve the purposes of the void." She reached out her hand toward the harp, but Elrond caught her wrist. "Nay, lady, the burden is too great for any one person to bear. If the harp is to be played, it must be by one who can endure its full power without being consumed." "Then let it be me," said Gandalf, stepping forward with his staff blazing white in the ancient chamber. "I am Mithrandir the Grey, and I have walked in the light of Valinor. If any here can endure the harp's music, it is I." But even as he spoke, the air of the chamber grew cold, and shadows began to gather in the corners where the light could not reach. From the darkness came a voice that spoke in harmonies twisted and wrong, a parody of the music that had shaped the world. "Too late," the voice whispered, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Too late, servants of the fading light. Even now, my master's power reaches across the gulf of space and time, and the corruption spreads." The fourth shard, which Pallando had brought from the Eagle's Eyrie, wrapped in cloths blessed by the Valar, began to pulse with dark radiance. The corruption within it was spreading, reaching out tendrils of shadow that sought to touch the other fragments of Narsil. "Alatar," whispered Pallando, his face white with horror and grief. "My friend, what have you become?" The voice that answered was no longer entirely that of the Blue Wizard, but held undertones of something vast and hungry that dwelt in the spaces between the stars. "I have become what all must become in the end. The music is a lie, Pallando, a pretty song sung to mask the reality of the void that waits to claim all things. I have seen the truth that lies beyond creation, and I offer it to you now as a gift." The shadows in the chamber deepened, and through them stepped forms that hurt the mind to look upon, beings that had never known the touch of the flame imperishable, creatures of the hungry emptiness that lay beyond the circles of the world. They reached out with appendages that were not quite arms toward the shards of Narsil, seeking to claim them for their master. "Stand back!" cried Gandalf, raising his staff high. White fire blazed from its crystal head, driving back the creatures of the void. But their retreat was only temporary. More shadows gathered at the edges of the chamber, and the corruption of the fourth shard spread like poison through the very air. It was then that Tom Bombadil did something that surprised them all. Instead of fleeing or fighting, he began to sing, not in any language known to mortal tongues, but in the first music that had ever been heard in the emptiness before the world was made. His voice rose clear and true, and at its sound, the creatures of the void recoiled as if struck by whips of flame. "Now," he called to Galadriel, "while my song holds them at bay, take up the harp and play the song of cleansing." The Lady of Lothlorien stepped forward without hesitation, her hands closing around the frame of Tyalaconda. The moment her fingers touched the ancient wood, light blazed from her like a star kindled in the darkness. and the harp began to sing with a voice that was both beautiful and terrible. The music that poured forth was the sound of creation itself, the melody that had shaped the mountains and filled the seas, the harmony that had kindled the first stars and set them dancing in their courses. But underneath it ran a deeper theme, sad and strange, that spoke of endings and partings, of the twilight that comes to all things beneath the sky. As the harp's music filled the chamber, the corruption began to leave the fourth shard like smoke rising from a dying fire. The twisted radiance faded, replaced by the pure light of creation, and the creatures of the void fled shrieking back to the darkness from whence they came. But the victory came at a terrible price. As the last notes of the Song of Cleansing faded into silence, Galadriel collapsed, her strength spent by the effort of wielding power beyond mortal understanding. The light of Nenya, her ring of power, flickered and dimmed, and all present knew that something irreplaceable had been lost. "It is done," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The fourth shard is cleansed, and the corruption can spread no further. But the price." She did not need to finish. All could see that the music of the harp had aged her beyond measure, and that the time of the elves in Middle-earth was drawing to its close. The cleansing of the shard had been achieved, but at the cost of hastening the fading of all that was fair and magical in the world. As word of the fourth shard's cleansing spread throughout Middle-earth, the very air seemed to thrum with tension, as if the world itself held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. In Isengard, Saruman paced the circle of Orthanc like a caged wolf, his rage at being thwarted in Moria consuming him from within. The Palantir upon his desk showed him visions of the chamber beneath Rivendell, and his heart burned with envy at the power he had witnessed there. "My lord," whispered Grima Wormtongue from the shadows, "perhaps it would be wisdom to seek alliance with this Alatar of whom the Blue Wizard spoke. If he commands the powers of the void—" "Silence, fool!" snarled Saruman, his staff striking sparks from the stone floor. "I am Saruman the White, chief of the Istari. I will not bow to any power, whether of shadow or void. The Shards of Narsil shall be mine, and through them I shall claim dominion over all the music of creation." "Pooh!" But even as he spoke, the White Wizard felt a chill touch his heart, for the Palantir showed him visions of the tower beyond Rune and of the being that dwelt within it. What had once been Alatar the Blue was now something else entirely, a conduit for powers that belonged to no earthly realm, a servant of the hungering emptiness that sought to devour all things. Far to the east, in the tower of black stone that drank light and gave back only darkness, the thing that had been Alatar felt the disturbance in the music that marked the fourth shard's cleansing. Its form was no longer entirely that of an Istari. The long communion with the void had changed it into something between wizard and wraith, a being of shadow and hunger that existed in the spaces between what was real and what was not. "The fool," it whispered in a voice like the sound of dying stars. "They think to defy the inevitable with their pretty songs and ancient harps, but they have only delayed the ending, not prevented it." Around the tower, the plane of black glass trembled as vast forms stirred beneath its surface, creatures of the void that had been given substance by their master's will, beings of pure negation that sought only to return all things to the emptiness from whence they came. "Let them gather their shards," the void servant continued, its eyes like holes in the fabric of reality. "Let them think themselves wise and powerful. In the end, all their efforts will serve only to bring the fragments together in one place, where I may claim them all at once." Meanwhile, in Rivendell, the company of the Shards prepared for the journey that all knew might be their last. The revelation that one of the Istari had fallen to the void had shaken the very foundations of their understanding. For if the servants of the Valar could be corrupted, what hope was there for lesser being? "We must move swiftly," urged Elrond as the company gathered in the Hall of Fire. "Each day we delay, Alatar's power grows stronger, and the corruption he spreads reaches further into the fabric of reality." Aragorn, now bearing 2 of the cleansed shards at his side, nodded grimly. The path to the east is long and perilous, and we cannot know what enemies await us in the lands beyond Rune, but we have no choice. The quest must be completed, whatever the cost. Boromir, still bearing the first shard recovered from Anduin's depths, spoke with the voice of a captain who had seen many battles. We will need allies in the east, for our company alone cannot hope to storm a fortress defended by the powers of the void. What aid can we call upon in those distant lands? It was Pallando who answered, his face grave with the memory of his long wandering. There are the Easterlings who have not bent the knee to Sauron, proud peoples who remember the days when their lands were green and fair. And in the far south, beyond the deserts of Nir Harad, dwell the Númenóreans in exile, descendants of those who fled the downfall in ships swifter than the wind. And the eagles, added Radagast, his brown eyes bright with hope. Gwaihir and his people have sworn to aid us, for they remember the days when the skies were free from shadow, and they would see them so again. Legolas, who had been silent throughout the council, now spoke. There is another power that might aid us, though it is one that has not stirred in many years. In the depths of Fangorn Forest, the Ents have awakened from their long slumber, roused by the corruption that spreads from the east. Treebeard himself has spoken of marching to war, should the need be great enough. Then let them all be summoned, said Galadriel, though her voice was weaker than before, still bearing the cost of wielding the harp of restoration. For the final battle draws near, and we will need all the aid that can be mustered. As the company made ready to depart, messages were sent by swift riders and soaring eagle to all the corners of Middle-earth. The Ents of Fangorn began their slow march eastward, their voices raised in songs that had not been heard since the elder days. The eagles of the misty mountains gathered in vast flocks, their wings darkening the sky as they flew toward the appointed meeting. From the south came ships bearing the banners of the faithful, and from the north rode the rangers of Eriador, their gray cloaks streaming in the wind. But even as the forces of the free peoples gathered, dark tidings came from the lands beyond Rune. Refugees fleeing westward spoke of cities swallowed by shadows, of forests withering at the touch of an unnatural blight, and of the very stars growing dim in the eastern sky. The corruption spreads faster than we feared, reported one of the Dunedain, who had ridden far to gather intelligence. Entire kingdoms have fallen to the Void Servant's power, their people transformed into wraiths that serve his will. The very land itself grows sick and twisted, as if reality itself is being unraveled. The race against time had begun, and the fate of all Middle-earth hung in the balance. The company of the Shards would have to reach the tower beyond Rune before Alatar's power grew too great to challenge, but the path ahead was fraught with perils beyond imagining. As they rode out from Rivendell in the gray light of dawn, each member of the company carried with them the weight of destiny. They bore not only the Shards of Narsil, but the hopes and fears of all who dwelt beneath the sky, and they knew that failure would mean not merely death, but the unmaking of everything they held dear. The final act of the great drama was about to begin, and none could say how it would end. Across the vast expanse of Rovanion, the company rode, following paths known only to the Dunedain and the wandering companies of Eld, who had not yet taken ship into the west. Behind them stretched a great host, such as had not been seen since the days of Gil-galad and Elendil, the last alliance of East united in common cause against the threat of the Void. The Ents marched with strides that shook the earth, their ancient voices raised in songs that made the very hills tremble. Quick Beam, his swifter kindred, scouted ahead, their branchy forms moving through the forests with a speed that belied their apparent clumsiness. Above them flew the eagles in numbers beyond counting, their wings forming a cloud that cast shadows across the land. From the south had come warriors whose ancestors had sailed from Númenor before its fall. Tall men with gray eyes and noble bearing, clad in mail that caught the light like scales of silver fish. Their ships had borne them up the rivers that flowed from the distant seas, and their banners bore the 7 stars and the white tree that had been the emblems of Elendil the Tall. The peoples of the east who had answered the call were strange to Western eyes, horsemen from the plains beyond the Sea of Rune, whose steeds ran like the wind across the grasslands, and mountain folk whose knowledge of hidden ways surpassed even that of the dwarves. They came not out of love for Gondor or Rohan, but because they had seen the darkness spreading from the uttermost east. They knew that none would be spared if the Void Servant achieved his purpose. At the head of this mighty host rode the company of the Shard, now grown to include heroes whose names would be remembered in song for as long as tales were told. Aragorn bore 2 shards upon his sword belt, their pure light a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. Boromir carried the fragment that had been drawn from Anduin's depth, and Pallando bore the 4th shard, now cleansed of corruption, but still singing with harmonies that spoke of distant peril. It was on the 5th day of their eastward journey that they encountered the first of their enemies. The company had made camp beside a stream that ran clear and cold from the northern mountains when the watch reported strange lights moving in the darkness beyond their sentry. "Form the line," commanded Boromir, his voice carrying clearly across the camp. "Shield wall to the east, see." But the creatures that emerged from the darkness were unlike any foe they had faced before. These were not orcs or Uruk-hai, nor even the fell beasts that served the Dark Lord of Mordor. They were beings of living shadow, forms that seemed to shift and change, even as they moved. Creatures of the void given temporary substance by their master's will. "Hold fast!" cried Aragorn, drawing Andúril from its sheath. The blade blazed with the light of the 2 shards that hung at his side, and where its radiance touched the shadow creatures, they writhed and dissolved like mist before the morning sun. The battle that followed was unlike any in the long annals of Middle-earth's wars. The shadow creatures could not be harmed by common weapons, but fled shrieking from the light of the shard and the blessed blades that some among the company bore. The Ents strode among the enemy like towers of living wood, their voices raised in songs that made the very air tremble with power. Above the battle, Gwaihir and his eagles circled like a storm of wings and talons, striking down the flying shadows that sought to attack from above. Their cries rang out across the night, fierce and proud, as they avenged themselves upon the creatures that had dared to pollute the clean air of the sky. When the dawn came, the shadow creatures had vanished like nightmares banished by the light, but all knew that this had been but a foretaste of what awaited them in the east. The very air seemed different now, thinner and colder, as if they were traveling not just across the leagues of Middle-earth, but into realms where different laws held sway. "We draw near to our destination," said Pallando grimly as they broke their fast beside the stream. "I can feel Alatar's presence like a weight upon my heart. He knows we come, and he prepares his defenses." It was then that an unexpected messenger arrived, a great eagle whose wings were darker than night, and whose eyes held depths of knowledge that spoke of high places and long vigil. This was Thorondor, the king of eagles, greatest of his race, who had flown from his halls in the far north to bring word to the army. "Hail, defenders of the light," he called as he alighted before the company's leader. "I bring greeting from Manwë the Elder King, who watches from his halls upon Tanicatil. The Valar are aware of the peril that threatens Middle-earth, and though they may not intervene directly, they send their blessing upon your endeavor." From beneath his wing he drew a horn carved from a single crystal, and its surface gleamed with inner light that was neither silver nor gold, but something purer than both. "This is the Horn of Calling," Thorondor explained, "wrought in the music's dawn for the summoning of aid in the darkest hour. When all seems lost and hope has fled, wind it thrice, and help will come from the uttermost west." Aragorn received the horn with trembling hands, feeling the weight of destiny that lay upon it. "My lord," he said to the great eagle, "tell me truly, can we succeed in this quest? Can the Void Servant be defeated by mortal power?" Thorondor's golden eyes regarded him steadily. "The future is not fixed, son of Arathorn. Many paths stretch out before you, and some lead to victory, while others lead to defeat. But know this, the power you carry in the Shards of Narsil is greater than you know, for they were wrought not merely with skill, but with love. And love, though it may seem weak against the forces of the void, has its own strength that cannot be unmade. With these words, the King of Eagles spread his wings and soared away toward the west, leaving the company to ponder his message as they prepared to continue their journey into the heart of darkness. The stage was set for the final confrontation, and though none could foresee the outcome, all were resolved to see the quest through to its end, whatever that might be. The fate of Middle-earth, and perhaps of all creation, hung in the balance, and the last throw of the dice was about to be cast. For 7 more days they traveled eastward, and with each league the land grew more strange and terrible. The grass withered beneath their feet, and the streams ran black with corruption that seemed to eat at the very stones of their beds. The sky grew darker, though no clouds obscured the sun, and the stars seemed to flicker and dim as if they were candles guttering in a wind that blew from beyond the world. On the 7th day, they came at last within sight of their destination. Upon a plain of black glass that stretched to the horizon rose a tower of such malevolent aspect that the very sight of made strong hearts quail. It was built of stones that had never known the light of sun or star, and its surface seemed to drink in all radiance and give back only darkness. Around its base writhed forms that hurt the mind to look upon. The servants of the void made manifest, creatures of pure negation that sought only to return all things to the emptiness from whence they came. "Behold," said Pallando, his voice heavy with sorrow, "the tower of unmaking, where my friend and companion has made his dwelling. From its heights he commands powers that were never meant to exist within the circles of the world." As they watched, a horn sounded from the tower's peak, not the clear call of silver or gold, but a note that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. In answer to its summons, the shadow creatures that had harried their journey began to gather in vast numbers, pouring from cracks in the black glass, like water from a broken dam. "They mean to overwhelm us with numbers," observed Gimli, hefting his axe with grim determination. "Let them come! Every dwarf of Durin's line is worth a dozen such wraiths." But Gandalf, who had been silent for much of the journey, now spoke with a voice that carried the weight of prophecy. "Numbers will not decide this battle, my friend. The true struggle will be fought not with blade and bow, but with will and wisdom, in the realm of the spirit where such creatures have their truest existence." It was then that the most unexpected sight of all greeted their eyes. From the western horizon came a great dust cloud, and beneath it rode a host that made even their mighty army seem small by comparison. At its head flew banners of white and silver, and the riders wore the colors of Rohan and Gondor. "Reinforcements!" cried Boromir with joy, but his elation was short-lived. As the newcomers drew closer, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. The riders moved with unnatural precision. Their faces, hidden beneath helmets, reflected no light, and their horses ran without touching the ground. "Wraiths," whispered Legolas, his keen eyes reading the signs that others could not see. "The enemy has corrupted an entire army and turned them into servants of the void." The trap was sprung, and the company of the Shards found themselves caught between the tower and the approaching host of the undead. The final battle was about to begin, and none could say who would emerge victorious from the field. Upon the plain of black glass, the last great battle of the Third Age began, not with the clash of steel on steel, but with a contest of wills that shook the very foundations of reality. The Wraith army that bore the corrupted banners of Rohan and Gondor struck the eastern flank of the allied host like a wave of shadow, while from the Tower of Unmaking poured forth creatures of the void in numbers beyond counting. Aragorn drew Andúril, and the reforged blade blazed with the light of the 2 shards that hung at his side. Where its radiance touched the shadow creatures, they dissolved like mist before the dawn. But for every one destroyed, 2 more took its place. "The shards!" cried Gandalf, his staff blazing white as he drove back a cluster of wraiths. "We must bring them together before we are overwhelmed." Boromir fought his way through the press of enemies, toward the place where Aragorn made his stand, the first shard singing with power at his side. Pallando, bearing the cleansed fourth fragment, called upon arts learned in his long wandering, weaving barriers of light that held back the tide of darkness. Above the battle, the eagles of Thorondor struck at the flying shadows that sought to descend upon the army from above. Gwaihir's voice rang out like a trumpet of gold as he led his people in their ancient war cry, and the sound of it gave heart to all who fought below. The Ents strode across the battlefield like moving hills, their voices raised in songs that made the black glass tremble and crack. Where their feet fell, green shoots sprang up from the corrupted earth, as if the very presence of the tree shepherds brought life to places where only death had dwelt. But for all their valor, the defenders were being slowly pushed back toward the base of the tower. The creatures of the void seemed endless in number, and each wave that was repelled was followed by another, larger and more terrible than the last. It was then that a horn sounded from the tower's peak, not the fell note that had summoned the Shadow Army, but the clear call of silver that spoke of hope in darkness. From the highest window of the Tower of Unmaking stepped a figure clad in robes of starlight, and his voice rang out across the battlefield with power that made all other sounds fade to whispers. "Hold!" commanded the figure, and at his word, the creatures of the void ceased their advance and turned their eyeless faces toward their master's dwelling. "Let there be parley between the servants of light and darkness, that we may speak as equals before the final blow is struck." Slowly, the battling armies drew apart, forming a circle of clear ground around the base of the tower. Into this space stepped the leaders of both sides, Aragorn bearing 2 shards, Boromir with the first, Pallando with the fourth, and Gandalf with his staff blazing like a star. From the tower came a figure that had once been Alatar the Blue, but was now something far more terrible and strange. The Void Servant retained the shape of an Istari, but his robes were woven from the darkness between stars, and his eyes held depths that reflected nothing save the hungry emptiness that lay beyond the world. In his hands, he bore a staff crowned with a crystal of such absolute blackness that it seemed to drink in light itself. "Greetings, my brother Istari," he said, his voice carrying harmonies that were beautiful and terrible in equal measure. "I had hoped you would come, for there are things I would show you before the ending." "Alatar," said Gandalf sadly, "what have you become? Once you walked in the light of Valinor and sang with the music of the spheres. How came you to serve the powers of the void?" The corrupted wizard smiled, and his smile was like the light of dying stars. "I have seen the truth that lies beyond all pretty lies, Mithrandir. The music of creation is but a brief song sung in the face of eternal silence. The void is not evil. It is simply the natural state of things, the peace that comes when all struggle ends." He raised his staff, and at its gesture, the air above the battlefield shimmered like heat haze. In the distortion, visions appeared, images of Middle-earth, as it would be when the void had claimed it. There were no wars, no suffering, no pain of any kind, for there was nothing at all save the sweet emptiness of non-existence. "Behold," Alatar continued, "the gift I offer to all who dwell beneath the sky. No more will children weep for fallen fathers. No more will lovers part in sorrow. No more will the aged suffer the weight of years. All will be at peace in the embrace of the void." "That is not peace," said Aragorn firmly, his hand upon the hilt of Andúril. "That is death, and death without meaning. We choose to live, whatever the cost." "Do you indeed?" asked the Void Servant, his voice soft as silk over steel. "Even when that life brings nothing but suffering to those you claim to love? Tell me, son of Arathorn, how many have died for your crown? How many more will die before your reign is ended?" The words struck home like arrows, for Aragorn had indeed seen death follow in his wake, and his heart was heavy with the weight of those who had fallen in his service. But before doubt could take root in his mind, another voice spoke, clear and strong and filled with the music of creation itself. "He speaks the lie that dwells at the heart of all despair," said Tom Bombadil, stepping forward from among the ranks of the defenders. "For life without sorrow is not life at all, but merely existence. It is the joy that comes after pain, the love that grows stronger through loss, the hope that shines brightest in darkness. These are the things that make life worth the living. The ancient beings' words rang with such truth that even the shadow creatures paused in their restless writhing, as if some distant memory of what they had once been stirred within their emptiness. Alatar's face darkened with rage. Pretty words from a relic of forgotten ages, but words will not save you when the unmaking begins. He raised his staff high, and the crystal at its tip blazed with anti-light that hurt the soul to look upon. From the tower of unmaking came a sound like the breaking of the world, not the clean snap of wood or stone, but the terrible rending of reality itself. I call upon the 3 shards that remain in my keeping, the void servant cried. Let them come forth and join their brothers in the great work of unmaking. From the tower's depths came 3 fragments of Narsil, but they were changed beyond recognition. Where once they had shone with the pure light of creation, now they pulsed with the hungry darkness of the void. Their song was no longer the melody of the music, but a discord that sought to unravel the very foundations of the world. 7 shards for 7 notes of the great song. Alatar continued, his voice rising to a shriek that made the sky itself tremble. But I have learned to sing them backward, to reverse the melody of creation, and return all things to the silence that came before. The corrupted shards rose into the air, drawn by the power of their master's will, and as they moved, the fabric of reality began to fray around them. The very air cracked like glass, revealing glimpses of the hungry void that lay beyond. But it was then that the greatest shock of all awaited the defender. From among their own ranks stepped a figure in white robes, his staff blazing with crystal fire, his face set with grim determination. I think, said Saruman the White, that the time has come for truth to be spoken. The appearance of Saruman upon the battlefield sent a shock through the ranks of both armies. The White Wizard strode forward with measured steps, his staff blazing with power, until he stood between the 2 forces like a pillar of flame in the darkness. My lord Saruman, said Aragorn, his hand still upon his sword, what brings you to this place? We had not looked for aid from Isengard. The White Wizard's laugh was cold as winter wind. Aid? Nay, son of Isildur, I come not to give aid, but to claim what is rightfully mine. For too long have I played the part of faithful servant, while others wielded the true power. Understanding dawned like a terrible sunrise in the minds of all who heard him. Gandalf stepped forward, his gray eyes blazing with wrath and sorrow. You planned this from the beginning. The corruption of the shards, the corruption of Alatar himself, all of it was your design, not mine alone, Saruman replied with a smile that held no warmth. I had an excellent teacher in the arts of persuasion. Tell them, Alatar, or should I say, my most faithful pupil. Tell them how you learned to commune with the void. The being that had been Alatar the Blue turned toward his fellow wizard, and for the first time since his transformation, something like doubt flickered in his starless eyes. You said the visions came from beyond the world, that the void itself spoke to me in dreams. And so it did, Saruman confirmed, but only because I opened the way. The Palantir of Orthanc is a mighty seeing stone, but it can do more than show distant places. With the proper arts, it can pierce the barriers between what is and what is not, can touch the minds of those who dwell in the emptiness beyond creation. The truth struck like a thunderbolt. Alatar had not fallen to the void of his own accord, but had been led there step by Saruman's subtle manipulation. The corruption of the Eastern Shards, the transformation of the Blue Wizard into a servant of nothingness, all had been part of a greater plan. But why? Asked Palando, his voice breaking with the pain of understanding. Why destroy your fellow Istari? Why risk the unmaking of all creation? Saruman's eyes blazed with the fire of ambition unleashed. Because I have seen what lies beyond the music, and I would be its master. The Valar sent us to guide the peoples of Middle-earth, but they gave us neither the power nor the authority to truly rule. The Void offers both, dominion over existence and non-existence alike. He raised his staff, and from its crystal head poured forth power such as had not been seen since the elder days. But this was not the clean strength of creation. It was the hungry force of unmaking, the desire to reduce all things to their component notes and reshape them according to his will. The 7 shards were but the beginning. The fallen wizard continued. Each fragment carries within it one of the fundamental notes of creation. Gather them all together and speak the words of unmaking, and reality itself becomes clay in the hands of one who knows the proper forms. The corrupted shards that hung in the air around Alatar began to move, drawn by Saruman's will toward the fragments carried by the defender. If they were united under his control, the White Wizard would have the power to unmake and remake the world according to his desires. But it was then that Aragorn did something that none had expected. Instead of drawing his sword or calling upon the power of the shards he bore, he reached for the horn of calling that Thorondor had given him. The crystal instrument blazed like a star as he set it to his lips and blew 3 long, clear notes that rang across the battlefield and beyond. The sound of the horn carried farther than mere music should have traveled, across the leagues of Middle-earth, over the mountains and seas, even to the uttermost west, where the Valar kept their watch. And in answer to its call came aid from the most unexpected quarter. The sky above the Tower of Unmaking began to brighten, though no sun shone there. From the growing radiance stepped figures of such majesty and power that all present, Istari, elf lords, and shadow creatures alike, fell to their knees in awe. These were the Valar themselves, the guardians of creation, come at last to intervene in the affairs of Middle-earth. At their head strode Manwë the Elder King, his robes streaming with the winds of the world, and beside him walked Varda the Star Queen, her hands bright with the light of the first star. "Enough," said Manwë, and his voice was like the sound of great winds among mountain peaks. "The time has come for this madness to end." But Saruman, drunk on the power he had tasted, raised his staff in defiance of the powers themselves. "You are too late. The shards answer to my will now, and through them I command the very foundations of creation." The corrupted fragments of Narsil blazed with dark fire as they flew toward their master. But as they moved, something wonderful and terrible happened. The 4 shards carried by the defenders, cleansed of corruption and pure with the light of creation, began to sing in harmony with their corrupted brothers. The music that arose was beyond all description, for it was the song of the Ainur itself, the melody that had shaped the world in the beginning. But it was changed now, grown richer and more complex through the long ages of its existence, deepened by the joys and sorrows of all who had lived and loved and died beneath the sky. "No!" screamed Saruman, feeling his control slip away as the true power of the shards asserted itself. "I am their master. They belong to me." The song had its own will, and it would not be bound by the ambitions of any single being. The 7 shards of Narsil came together in a blaze of light that outshone the sun, and in that radiance all present saw the truth that lay at the heart of creation. The sword had never been merely a weapon of war. It was a focus for the music itself, a means by which the fundamental forces of reality could be given shape and form. And its breaking had not been a tragedy, but a necessity, for only by being shattered could its true power be released. As the shards merged once more into a single blade, the corruption that had touched them was burned away like dross in a forge. Alatar cried out as the void's influence was torn from his mind, leaving him once again simply a wizard of the Istari, fallen and ashamed but free. But Saruman, who had willingly embraced the power of unmaking, found that it turned upon him with terrible force. His form began to unravel like a tapestry pulled apart, and his screams echoed across the plain as he was consumed by the very nothingness he had sought to master. When the light faded and the music fell silent, there stood upon the black glass a sword reborn, not the blade that Isildur had borne to Mount Doom, but something greater and more terrible. This was Narsil as it had been meant to be, wrought not merely of steel and starlight, but of the very essence of creation itself. Aragorn stepped forward and took the sword in his hands, feeling its weight and balance, understanding at last the true burden that had been placed upon his bloodline. This was not merely the Sword of King, but the guardian of reality itself, a weapon that could defend the music of creation against all who would seek to pervert it. The battle was over, and the shadow of the void had been banished from Middle-earth. But as the defenders looked upon the reforged blade, they understood that this was not an ending, but a beginning. For the song of creation was never finished, and there would always be those who sought to change its melody for their own purpose. The blade of Narsil had been made whole once more, but the price of its remaking was the knowledge that the music itself was vulnerable, and that eternal vigilance would be the price of its preservation. The sword would be passed down through the line of Isildur's heirs, and with it, the responsibility to guard the fundamental forces that held all things in their proper places. As the armies departed from that field of battle and the Tower of Unmaking crumbled into dust, the age of the sword-bearers began. And though the tales of Middle-earth would speak of this as the end of the Third Age, those who had witnessed the reforging knew better. It was not an ending at all, but the first note of a new movement in the endless symphony of creation, a melody that would play on until the last star guttered out and the music itself came to its final, perfect chord. Thus ends the tale of the Shards of Narsil, and thus begins the legend of the Sword Reborn, guardian of the song that shapes all things beneath the sky.